Holland. The night of November 2nd, 1944. Along the Mark River, a German sentry on the north bank stood no more than 150 yards from the water. His unit, the 700th Static Infantry Division, had been told the same thing every German infantryman on this front had heard for weeks. The Americans on the other side were green. They were a brand new division. They had never once been in a fight. They were college boys, pulled from universities and rushed to Europe to fill the manpower hole the Normandy campaign had punched in the army. The orders were to hold the line. They would not move at night. They were simply not that kind of army. It was raining. The sentry's boots were filled with cold water. The flat Dutch polder in front of him was a mess of sucking mud, reeds, ditches, and barbed wire. His division had held this line for days, growing comfortable with one truth about this enemy. The Americans always came in the morning. They came with tanks and aircraft and artillery preparation. They came loud. He had plenty of time. And then, as dawn started to gray the sky, the sentry looked across the river and saw no one there. No one was there because the men of the 415th Infantry Regiment were already on his side of the water. They had crossed the Mark River in the dark, using assault boats. There was no artillery preparation, no aircraft, no searchlights, and no warning. They had walked right past his outposts, and the outposts had not heard a thing. They had slipped through the gap between his platoon and the next one, and the men in those positions had not seen them. By the time the sun came up, an entire American bridgehead was already established at Standar-Buiten, and German prisoners were being marched back to the south bank, while the sentry's officers screamed into their field telephones that this was impossible. Over the next 6 months, this exact scene would happen again and again, in towns with names most Americans have never even heard. Eschweiler, Inden, Lucherberg, Honef. German prisoners brought into American interrogation tents would all say the same thing in slightly different words. We were watching the road. We were watching the field. We did not see them come. We did not hear them. We do not understand how they got behind us. And this was the part that nobody on the German side could accept. This wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a special weapon. It was not intelligence work, or code breaking, or some new type of paratrooper. It was an idea, a doctrine, a way of thinking about combat that one disgraced American general fired in front of his own men a year earlier had drilled into a brand new division of college kids, trained into their bones until they became the only American formation in Europe that the Germans truly could not see coming. To understand why a German sentry on the Mark River was staring at an empty riverbank when the sun came up, we have to go back to a Tunisian battlefield where a different American army had just been utterly humiliated. Back to a fight that would end up deciding everything. Because the doctrine that put those Timberwolves on the wrong side of the river that morning was forged in the worst place the American army had ever been, and the man who forged it was about to be told, in the most public way possible, that the army did not want him anymore. Part 1. The night belonged to Germany. Here is a fact every American military historian has to come to terms with at some point. The German army of World War II was, infantry to infantry, the best defensive force on the planet. This wasn't because of any racial myth or fanaticism. It was because of doctrine, training, and how they thought about the ground. When a German rifle company occupied a position in 1944, it followed a sequence refined since 1916. The company commander would walk his ground in daylight and choose his fields of fire. Then his platoons dug in along reverse slopes, where Allied artillery could not see them. Then they laid wire. Then they pre-registered every approach with mortars. Then they put out listening posts at 50 yards, 100 yards, and 200 yards. They set their sentry rotation. And then, when the sun went down, the night belonged to them. German sentries on the Western Front were trained to hold a 10-degree arc of attention for 2 hours at a time. They were issued flare pistols to mark intruders for their machine gunners. The Wehrmacht's doctrine taught the fire position. You did not move from it at night. You waited. You let the enemy come to you. And why was this so devastatingly effective against the Americans in particular? Because the American army of 1942, 43, and most of 1944 was, by its own admission, not very good at night. Their boys came in daylight, in waves, with armor, after artillery preparation. We could see them coming. The night was ours. That German contempt for the average GI, on this point, is well documented. In captured letters and diaries from the Western Front, you find German soldiers writing things that no German on the Eastern Front would ever dare write about a Russian. One infantryman wrote that the American soldier doesn't attack without aircraft and tanks, saying he's too cowardly for that. Another, in a letter cited in the 99th Infantry Division's official history, wrote, "The American infantryman isn't worth a penny." This was the consensus inside the German army by 1944. Our infantry will hold. Theirs cannot fight in the dark. And the place where this contempt was most tragically proven correct was the Kasserine Pass. February 14th, 1943, Tunisia. The American Second Corps, brand new to combat, ran directly into the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's army. What followed was the most humiliating defeat the United States Army would suffer in the European theater of operations. Over 6,000 Americans were captured. Hundreds were killed. American units abandoned their positions, lost their equipment, and fled in jeeps. Rommel himself, in his field journal, called the American troops on his front unorganized, untrained, and very badly led. Among the American officers fighting at Kasserine was the tall, lean, 54-year-old Major General named Terry de la Mesa Allen. Allen was commanding the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one. And in the long catalogue of failure at Kasserine, his division was one of the few American formations that did not break. The 1st held, and it counterattacked. It eventually pushed the Germans out of the gap. By the end of the Tunisian campaign in the summer of 1943, Terry Allen was on the cover of Time magazine. In the public imagination, he was the American answer to Rommel, and then General Omar Bradley fired him. In August 1943 on Sicily, General Bradley relieved General Allen of command in front of his officers. The official reason was a lack of discipline. Allen's men admired him, but to the point of insubordination. They wore wool caps, not helmets, and saluted only when they chose to. Bradley was a methodical, by-the-book commander who saw the Big Red One as Terry Allen's private army, and he wanted it back. Allen was sent home to Washington. By any conventional measure, his career was finished. High-level commanders fired from divisional command seldom returned. But Allen had learned something in Tunisia that his colleagues didn't understand. He'd spent months in the African dark, watching how the Germans actually fought. He had learned what their sentries could see and what they could not. He saw their entire defensive strategy rested on one critical assumption, that the Americans would always attack in the morning. And he grew convinced of something that would have sounded absurd to other commanders in 1943. The way to defeat the German infantry wasn't to outshoot them or outgun them during the day. It was to steal the night from them. In October 1943, while supposedly sidelined at the War Department, Allen received a phone call. Camp Carson, Colorado. A new infantry division, the 104th, was being formed. They were in need of a commanding general. The unit was originally made up of men from the Pacific Northwest, calling themselves the Timberwolves after their gray wolf patch insignia. They had no battle honors. They had no combat experience at all, and the army was about to ship them to Europe, ready or not. Terry Allen accepted the command. On the train to Colorado, he began writing the doctrine that would let a German sentry on the Mark River 14 months later stare at an empty riverbank, unable to explain how American soldiers had simply walked past him in the dark. But a doctrine was only half the battle. To forge this idea into a weapon, he needed to do something the United States Army had never really attempted before. He had to take an entire infantry division of 15,000 men and completely rewire their nervous systems for darkness. And as the Timberwolves would soon learn, the price of that rewiring wouldn't be paid in dollars, but in blood. Part 2. The Architect. Camp Carson, Colorado, January 1944. The first thing the men of the 104th noticed was their new general didn't look very impressive. Allen was tall, but he stooped slightly. His uniform was worn in, his helmet straps unbuckled in photos. He had a long, weathered face. And when he first addressed the assembled regiments, he didn't speak of glory. He spoke about what it takes to win. On June 15, 1944, for Infantry Day, Allen reviewed his troops at Camp Carson. The press was there to record his words. This war, Allen said, will be won by the infantry. The man who can strike on the ground, engage the enemy hand to hand, and hold the ground that he has won. That is why the infantry must be there. The toughest soldiers in the army. This was a description of the exact job the 104th was about to do. And that job, as Allen decided during the quiet months between his firing and his new command, was going to be done at night. Here's what the official Army training standard for night operations was in 1944. 8 to 12 hours per week. That was the official standard. Allen completely ignored it. According to historical records and news accounts from Carson, he forced his men to train at night between 30 and 35 hours a week. That's 3 to 4 times the Army norm. For months, in the cold Colorado darkness, the Timberwolves crawled. They ran patrols. They practiced river crossings with no lights. They learned to stay together as a unit without any visual signals. They created a system of passwords and recognition, using words a German tongue couldn't pronounce easily, words full of the letter L, which German speakers often soften. Passwords that, if a German spy tried to use them, would give him away by the sound of his own voice. Allen had brought a critical insight with him from the 1st Infantry Division, one that was hard-won back in Tunisia. He had observed that night attacks on fortified positions usually resulted in fewer casualties than daylight assaults. The German defensive edge, pre-aimed mortars, machine gun nests, and artillery all depended on visibility. If you took away their ability to see, you took away most of their advantage. His doctrine wasn't just attack at night. Many armies had tried that. What Allen taught was more nuanced. He taught that night fighting demanded a new kind of soldier. Slower on the approach, but faster in the assault, willing to fight up close with bayonets and grenades, not rifles, and ready to operate without the comfort of artillery fire beforehand. It demanded infantry soldiers trained to believe they would be the only weapon in the fight. And here, Allen was handed an unexpected advantage. By the time he took command, the 104th had been filled with thousands of soldiers from the Army Specialized Training Program, or ASTP. These were college students, pulled from universities to receive accelerated technical training. In early 1944, the Army shut the program down because it desperately needed riflemen. The bitter ASTP students were dumped into infantry divisions that needed bodies. The 104th received a substantial number of them. The result, as a division historian later wrote, was a unit where about half the men had some of the highest measured IQs in the entire Army. They were exceptionally trainable. They could memorize complex passwords. They could study terrain on maps and recall it perfectly in the dark. They could manage the stress of moving without being able to see. They also, as veterans of the program would later admit, had a massive chip on their shoulder. They had been promised officer commissions but were handed Moen-Garand rifles instead. They wanted to prove the Army had made a mistake. Allen gave them that chance. By the time the Timberwolves shipped out, sailing on August 27, 1944, in the first convoy to go directly from the U.S. to France without stopping in Britain, they had a doctrine, a name, and a slogan. The doctrine was night fighting. The name they would quickly earn was Night Fighters. And the slogan, which Allen wrote on his orders to his regiments, was, "Nothing in hell must stop the Timberwolves." They made landfall at Cherbourg on September 7, 1944. Almost immediately, they were attached to the British and Canadian First Army for Operation Pheasant, clearing the Scheldt estuary so the vital port of Antwerp could finally open to Allied shipping. It was a miserable operation, fought in wet country full of dikes under a cold rain that never stopped. The Timberwolves crossed the Belgian-Dutch border on October 23rd and attacked on the 25th. What happened next, in the careful language of British and Canadian reports, was unprecedented. The Timberwolves drove forward day and night, with a heavy emphasis on night attacks. They inflicted casualties at a rate that astonished their British allies, liberating Zundert and overrunning the Vart Canal defenses. They reached the Mark River by October 31st and crossed it on the night of November 2nd, 1944, in an operation executed exactly as Terry Allen had taught them. The attack relied on assault boats in complete darkness, with no artillery preparation. The first wave moved silently through the German outpost line, finding the gaps left by a defensive doctrine that was designed for daylight. By the time the alarm was finally raised, the Americans were already on the north bank in force, and the bridgehead could not be saved. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, a man not known for complimenting American units, sent his personal congratulations. So did the Canadian First Army Command. Allen, in his characteristic way, sent copies of the messages to every regiment with his own added line. Nothing in hell must stop the Timberwolves. But men like these didn't fight to be remembered. Most Americans today have never heard of the 104th Infantry Division. If keeping this kind of story alive matters to you, hitting the like button helps our channel push it to people who care about the history that didn't make the textbooks. It takes just a second, but it's a simple way to honor men who paid in blood. Still, the Mark River was a small operation. In the grand arithmetic of the war in Europe, Holland was a sideshow. The real test of Allen's doctrine was waiting for the Timberwolves on the German border, and on November 16th, 1944, 6 days after entering the line, they attacked the most heavily defended ground the Wehrmacht had, the Siegfried Line, the Dragon's Teeth, the killing zones, 5 years in the making. Official histories tend to describe the next 3 months in technical language, but the men who survived it did not use technical language at all. They used the same word the Germans used, Unbegreiflich, which means incomprehensible. Part 3. The Mechanism. To understand why German sentries on the Ruhr Plain in November 1944 could not see the Americans coming, we have to look at the mechanics of a patrol once Terry Allen's doctrine had become second nature to his men. Let's start with what a patrol carried. A typical Timberwolf night attack patrol of 8 to 12 men went out with their rifles unloaded. That sounds like a typo. It is not. According to unit histories from 1945, and confirmed by veterans interviewed for the division newsletter, the Timberwolves, on night assaults, preferred bayonets and hand grenades over rifle fire. The reason was tactical. A muzzle flash gives away your position. A bayonet does not. A grenade explodes in the enemy's foxhole, not yours, pushing the visual signature of the fight away from you. The Timberwolves trained until killing with cold steel and explosives at close range was automatic, and only then did they move forward. Now, consider this from the German sentry's perspective. He has been trained for years to listen for the click of a rifle bolt, the snap of a safety catch, the distinctive sound of a Garand firing. He is listening for the signs of a conventional American attack. What he hears instead, if he hears anything, is wet boots on dirt, the slither of cloth, the rustle of webbing. He can't tell in the dark if it's 1 man or 12. By the time he understands, the bayonets are already in his trench. On top of that, there was the Timberwolves' password discipline. The phonetic trick of choosing passwords with the letter F, like 5 fish or 4 freedoms, was based on a specific linguistic fact. German speakers pronouncing English F words tend to soften them toward a V. A German infiltrator would betray himself on the very first syllable. This was not just a theory. Joe Cervantes, a 104th veteran, recalled in the division newsletter, The Griffin, how difficult it was to maintain contact in the darkness. So, they had passwords. He explained that since Germans struggled to pronounce the letter F, passwords were often things like 5 fish or 4 freedoms. Added to that was Allen's insistence on using his reconnaissance platoons as the eyes of every operation. These intelligence and reconnaissance platoons were not unique to the 104th. They existed in all American infantry divisions. But on Allen's front, they were used exactly as they had been designed to be used. 2-man and 4-man teams pushed deep into the German rear, sometimes miles past the front line, to map fields of fire, identify weak points, and find gaps a night attack could exploit. And for a perfect example of what these I and R platoons could do, we have to leave the Timberwolves for a moment and look at a different American division. The 99th Infantry Division, the 394th Infantry Regiment, its intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, 18 men. The platoon was led by First Lieutenant Lyall J. Bouck, Jr. He was 20 years old. The day before his 21st birthday, December 16, 1944, his 18-man platoon would hold the village of Lanzerath against a battalion of 500 elite German Fallschirmjäger paratroopers. They single-handedly delayed the entire northern shoulder of the German Ardennes offensive for nearly 20 hours, long enough for Allied reinforcements to dig in. They would later become the most decorated American unit of their size in the Second World War. But that defensive stand is not why we're here today. So, what was Bouck's platoon doing in the weeks before the Bulge? According to official Army records, the answer was patrols. They pushed patrols up to 2 miles past the German front line, as far as Loheim, deep inside occupied territory, to capture enemy soldiers for interrogation. Most missions meant men creeping through snow-clogged ravines, shrouded in fog, trying to pinpoint the enemy's positions. For these actions, Bouck and several of his men were among the first in their entire regiment to be awarded the Combat Infantryman's Badge weeks before the Bulge began. How did 18 men, none of whom had ever fired a shot in combat, repeatedly slip past German sentries who had held that same ground for months? The answer is in their own records. They had been hand-picked for this work. Many were former Army Specialized Training Program men. They were disproportionately college-educated, expert marksmen, and in peak physical condition, and they mastered the little things. This included tripwires linked to pebble-filled cans, which the platoon strung around their positions as early warning devices. These were tripwires the Germans never expected, because German doctrine assumed Americans didn't patrol at night. They also built camouflaged pillboxes inside existing American foxholes. They deepened foxholes until 2 or 3 men could fire from under the cover of pine logs, and used a 5-inch snowstorm in mid-December for natural concealment. Now, multiply Bouck's 18 men across an entire infantry division, and you begin to see what German sentries on the Roer River were actually up against in late 1944. This was not the inexperienced American army Rommel had laughed at in Tunisia. This was not an army that only attacked in the morning. This was a different army, one that absorbed the lessons of Kasserine Pass and rewrote its night doctrine. Stolberg fell on November 16th. Eschweiler, the great industrial city near Aachen, fell on November 21st. Inden was cleared by December 2nd. The 104th's after-action reports tell the story. The Eschweiler operation featured a pre-dawn insertion of American troops directly into the city center. These men had crawled past German outposts in the dark and were already inside enemy lines when the sun rose. By the time the German garrison knew what was happening, the Timberwolves were attacking from inside and outside at once. And then came Lucherberg. Lucherberg was a small town past the Inden River. The 104th took it on the night of December 2nd, 1944, with companies of the 415th Infantry slipping across the river. The next morning at 7 a.m., a Timberwolf private named George Burns of Company F, part of a platoon that had taken 50% casualties in the night assault, looked out from a captured house and saw a German Tiger tank right in front of him. What he did next with a bazooka earned him the Distinguished Service Cross. The 104th's own history would call Burns a one-man army, but the battle for Lucherberg revealed something more. The German counterattack on December 3rd was savage King Tigers, SS infantry, and constant artillery barrages. Yet the Timberwolves held the town, using bayonets when ammunition ran low. They held it for days. This was General Allen's doctrine in action, and the Germans, watching from across the Ruhr River, could not believe what they were seeing. Their entire defensive system, the Dragon's Teeth, the bunkers, the pre-planned mortar strikes, had been built assuming any American attack would come by day with tanks and artillery. These night fighters broke every rule the Wehrmacht knew. But this success did not come free. At the Roer River, Eschweiler, Inden, Lucherberg, by Christmas 1944, the cost was being counted in graveyards. A private named Wayne Everett Bennett from West Virginia had enlisted in April, just 7 months before he died. He was killed in action on November 30th, 1944. He was 24 years old, leaving a wife and 2 sons. His body was returned home in 1947. His name isn't in any of the major war histories you might read. If you think stories like his deserve to be told, hit that like button. His unit took the city for him. The Timberwolves' method of war was working, but at a high price, and that price was about to get much steeper because the German army was about to do the unthinkable. It was about to attack. Part 4. The Reckoning. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. On the day Lyall Bouck turned 21, the German army did not give him a birthday present. It gave him an offensive of 200,000 men, 600 tanks, and Hitler's final hope for victory. Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Battle of the Bulge. 100 miles north of Bouck's position, the Timberwolves were holding a defensive line along the Ruhr River, opposite the German town of Duren. They had been ordered there on December 15th, one day before the offensive started. Their job for 2 months wouldn't be the attacks they had trained for. It was the ugly, defensive work of stopping the Germans from breaking through Aachen and collapsing the northern edge of the Bulge. And during this period, Something happened to the Timberwolves that the simple narrative of a brilliant new doctrine doesn't quite capture. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. They held a static line under daily artillery fire in deep snow, their offensive momentum completely gone. There was frozen feet, trench foot, frostbite, and the crushing exhaustion of 2 months of combat. Replacements arrived who hadn't gone through Allen's intense training and didn't know the doctrine in their bones. Robert Kremer, a replacement from New York, wrote in his memoir about joining a unit whose veterans knew things he had never been trained for. Kremer was a machine gunner. On his first guard duty in Lucherberg, watching German prisoners, his hand slipped on his pistol. A round fired into the floor, missing his feet by inches. The prisoners, German boys his own age, stopped laughing and just stared. Kremer later wrote that he was lucky he didn't become his own first kill of the war. This was the unspoken arithmetic of Allen's doctrine, a part of the story that post-war histories tend to downplay. Night fighting is brutally specialized work. Replacements who haven't done it are killed much faster than the men who have. By February 23rd, 1945, when the 104th crossed the Rohr River, the division had already absorbed waves of new soldiers. Lamersdorf, Inden, Lucherberg, all the places Allen's veterans remembered were now behind them. Ahead of them lay Cologne, the third largest city in Germany, the great cathedral city on the Rhine. It was a city the German High Command had promised Berlin would never fall. The Timberwolves entered Cologne on March 5, 1945. After 3 days of vicious street fighting against snipers, machine gun nests, and prowling tiger tanks, Cologne was in American hands by March 7th. And here we find a moment that, more than any other, captured what Allen's Timberwolves had become. Omar Bradley, the general who had fired Allen 18 months earlier, flew into Cologne to inspect the city. He arranged a meeting with Allen. According to memoirs and documents from the National Timberwolf Pups Association, Bradley said something to Allen that was simply extraordinary, given their history. "Terry," Bradley told him, "I'm pleasantly surprised to see these young Timberwolves of yours already ranked with the 1st and the 9th as the finest assault divisions in the ETO. The 1st and the 9th. The big red one that was Allen's old division, the one Bradley had taken from him. Allen's reply is preserved in the division's archives. "Brad," he said, "the 1st and the 9th are in damned fast company." 2 weeks later, on March 22, 1945, the 104th crossed the Rhine at Honef as part of the Remagen bridgehead. It was a night operation. By dawn, the Timberwolves were attacking east of the bridge. The Germans, desperate to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge, sent in their new Me, 262 jets. Fighting alongside the all-black 55th Anti-Aircraft Battalion, the Timberwolves held the bridgehead. The river barrier Germany had counted on for its last natural defense was gone, and for the 104th, it had been broken at night. Now, if your father, your grandfather, or your uncle served with the 104th or the 99th, or any infantry division in Europe between October 1944 and May 1945, the comments below are for their story. What unit were they in? Where did they fight? What did they tell you? If they told you anything at all. The stories that didn't make the official histories are the ones we need to hear most. Please share them. From the Rhine, the Timberwolves pushed east in some of the most rapid, sustained advances of the war. Division records show they covered 193 miles in 9 days, linking up with the 3rd Armored Division at Paderborn on April 1st, helping to seal the Ruhr Pocket. On April 11th, 1945, patrols from the 414th Infantry Regiment reached a place called Nordhausen. What they discovered there is documented in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and in the division's own after-action reports, the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. They found 5,000 corpses among roughly 6,000 inmates, with survivors too weak to stand. They also found the factory where slave labor had built the V-2 rockets. Joe Cervantes, the same veteran whose story we heard earlier, left a written account of that day. There were some 6,000 dead bodies in the camp, he later recalled, with perhaps up to 1,000 still alive. It was a horrible sight, one which will remain forever in our minds, and which caused me many sleepless nights. Don't let anyone ever tell you the Holocaust never happened. On April 26, 1945, the 104th made visual contact with Soviet forces at Prech on the Mulde River. The encirclement of Nazi Germany was now complete. The Timberwolves had fought for 195 consecutive days without ever being pulled from the line. They had done it Terry Allen's way at night. But the question we started with, why a German sentry could not see them coming, has one final layer. The answer wasn't just doctrine, training, or talented college boys with cans on tripwires. The answer was something deeper, something the German army never figured out how to copy. Part 5. Why Germany couldn't copy it. Now, here is a question worth considering for a moment. The German army of 1944 was arguably the most professionally educated infantry force on Earth. They knew what was happening to them on the Ruhr. They debriefed prisoners and wrote their own reports. So why, in the last 6 months of the war, did the German army fail to learn to fight at night like the Timberwolves? The first reason was industrial. By 1944, the German army was being hollowed out. The men with 3 years of Eastern Front experience were gone. The veterans, who could absorb a new doctrine and teach it to recruits, were either dead, captured, or wounded. The replacements were 16-year-old boys and 50-year-old factory workers. There was no training base left to teach a doctrine that required hundreds of hours of practice. The second reason was doctrinal. The German army's defensive skill depended on a key cultural assumption that Germans defended ground. They held it. In their doctrine, the night was a passive time, a time for sentries, for listening, for waiting for an enemy attack at dawn. To switch to a doctrine of aggressive night attacks would have meant completely rewriting how the German infantry even thought about combat. By 1944, with the Wehrmacht being squeezed from both sides at once, there was simply no time to do that. The third reason, and it's one German memoirs only hint at, is that for 5 years they were convinced they didn't need to. By the time the Timberwolves crossed the Mark River on November 2, 1944, the Germans had built their self-image around being masters of defensive warfare. To admit a new American division had taken the night from them was, on some level, to admit they'd lost the war, which they had. And so, when German prisoners were brought to interrogation tents at Eschweiler, Minden, Lucherberg, and Cologne, the words they used were not military words at all. These weren't the words of professional soldiers analyzing a problem. They were the words of men who had run out of categories. Incomprehensible. How did they do it? We never saw them. We never heard them. We simply do not understand. The answer they couldn't find was that the American forces they were facing had quietly become a different kind of army. Not the army of Tunisia, not the one Rommel had laughed at. This was an army that had absorbed the harshest lesson the Germans had ever taught. They took the defeat at Kasserine, forged it into a new doctrine, and built a 15,000-man weapon that crossed rivers in the dark and was inside German cities by sunrise. The final accounting for the 104th Infantry Division, from its official records, 195 straight days of combat from October 23, 1944 to May 7, 1945. 1,294 killed, 535 wounded, 385 missing, 2 Medals of Honor. This included one of only 7 awarded to black soldiers in all of World War II, posthumously to Private Willie F. James, Jr., plus 23 Distinguished Service Crosses, 642 Silver Stars, 51,727 German prisoners taken, and 2 concentration camps liberated. They cleared 8,000 square miles of European territory, an area roughly the size of Massachusetts. Terry Allen, the General Omar Bradley, fired in 1943, retired a major general. He passed away in 1969 in El Paso, Texas, and is buried at Fort Bliss National Cemetery, a place he'd spent most of his life around. His name isn't on the buildings. There is no major movie about him. He is the most decorated American combat general that most Americans have never heard of. Lyall Bouck, a lieutenant who turned 21 as the Bulge began, whose I and our platoon crept past German sentries, became a chiropractor in Missouri after the war. The medals his men deserved didn't arrive until 1981, 36 years after the actions that earned them. President Reagan signed the citations. The German sentries who couldn't see the Americans coming, the ones who used the word incomprehensible in interrogation tents, mostly went home to a country in ruins. The few who wrote about what they had seen used vague terms, describing how strange it was that the Americans on their front fought in a way the Wehrmacht was never trained to expect. The verdict, then, is not that the Americans of 1944 and 45 were braver than the Germans they fought. It's not that they were smarter, or that they had better equipment. The verdict is that one disgraced general, fired in front of his own men in 1943, used the next year and a half to design a doctrine that took the German army's single greatest tactical advantage. That advantage was ownership of the night, and he quietly stole it. Then he poured 15,000 college kids and Pacific Northwest farm boys into that doctrine until the doctrine became who they were. And then he sent them across rivers in the dark, into German cities at dawn, into the cathedrals of Cologne, and into the death factories of Nordhausen. He sent them until the Wehrmacht, looking at empty riverbanks and missing sentry posts, ran out of words for what was being done to them. They reached for the only one left in their language. Unbegreiflich, incomprehensible. If this forensic look at the men of the 104th and their cousins in the I&R platoon meant something to you, hitting the like button helps the channel reach more people who care about the parts of the war that didn't make it into the textbooks. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are more units like the Timberwolves whose stories history has yet to hear. And remember, war is doctrine and training and steel, but the men who fought were not numbers. They had names. They had wives waiting in Norwalk and Westport. They had children who grew up never quite understanding what their fathers had been a part of. They deserved to be remembered by their names and by what they did in the dark, when the Germans were so certain no one could touch them.